What if I told you there's a commander that turns flash and haste into a true win condition? Every attack buffs your board, and every time your creatures take damage, you are rewarded with treasure tokens. Once this deck gets rolling, it doesn't stop. Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic is one of the newest Universes Beyond cards we've just gotten through a secret lair drop. And honestly, Magic is getting absolutely wild with these crossovers. But here's the thing, even though Sonic might look like a meme commander, his abilities actually translate into a really fun and surprisingly powerful deck. Sonic is a 4-mana commander in Jeskai colors, and naturally he comes with haste. I mean, it wouldn't be Sonic if he didn't have haste, right? The real fun starts with his first ability. Gotta go fast. Every time Sonic attacks, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on every creature you control that either has haste or flash. This means every speedy boy you play will get rewarded with a permanent buff every single combat step. Over time, even your smallest haste creatures will snowball into huge threats. Then we get to his second ability, and this is where things get really powerful and really flavorful. Whenever one of your haste or flash creatures takes damage, you get to create a tap treasure token. And flavor wise, this is just perfect, just like Sonic dropping his rings whenever he takes damage. And yes, the secret lair even gave us ring treasure tokens, which is just hilarious. And in gameplay terms, this ability gets absolutely crazy. If your opponents decide to block your creatures or they decide to ping damage to your board, you will end up with a huge amount of treasure tokens. And of course, we're not limited on relying on our opponents to trigger this effect. We can even make these triggers happen ourselves. With a few cheap spells that deal 1 damage to every creature on the board, we can suddenly turn a board filled with flash and haste creatures into a massive amount of treasure tokens. So when you put it all together, Sonic isn't just flavor done right. He's actually a very strong commander with very unique abilities. His first ability pushes you toward building your deck with haste and flash creatures by buffing up their stats whenever you attack with them. And his second ability will just accelerate your mana like crazy. And these two things combined make for a deck that's really aggressive, resilient, and full of synergies you usually don't see together. This is a no budget list, and unlike my other decks, I did decide to run a few infinite combos in this deck. But that's just because they fit in naturally, and we would run the cards in the deck anyways, even if we didn't use them for the combo. In this video, I'll take you through all the interactions and synergies in this deck just so you can see how crazy this little hedgehog can be in Commander. As I do in all my videos, I will be going over every single card in the deck and explaining why I decided to include it. This video is divided up in 7 categories: the flash and haste creatures, the ring droppers, support, acceleration, card draw, interaction and protection, and the lands. Let's get started by talking about the flash and haste creatures. And obviously these cards are the backbone of this deck, because whenever you attack with Sonic, he will boost the stats of these cards, and whenever these creatures take damage with Sonic on the field, you will be generating treasure tokens. From cheap tempo pieces to heavy hitting finishers, these are the speedy boys that make this deck work. Ordos, Cobbler of War. Whenever this creature or any other creature enters the battlefield under your control, it will get +2 power until the end of the turn. And because almost all creatures in this deck already have haste, this is basically the mini version of an ogre battle driver. Since the +2 power boost will never go to waste, because you will instantly be able to swing with almost any creature you play in this deck. Now I know a 1/1 body for 2 mana might seem really vulnerable and really underwhelming, but just keep in mind, whenever you swing with Sonic and this is on the field, it will get a +1/+1 counter. So its body will just keep growing over the course of the game, and your opponents will have to deal with it at some point. And for 4 mana, you can activate Ardos' ability to create a 1/1 red goblin token with haste, which then in turn will be boosted to a 3/1 goblin for the remainder of the turn by Ardos' first ability. And since these tokens do have the haste keyword, you can put +1/+1 counters on them with Sonic, and whenever they take damage, they will generate you treasure tokens. An awesome ability for later in the game when you are able to generate a gazillion treasure tokens to just create yourself an army of goblins. Malcolm, Alluring Scoundrel, a 2 mana 2/1 flying creature with flash. And whenever this creature deals damage to an opponent, we get to put a chorus counter on him. Then we get to draw a card and discard a card. And if this card had 4 chorus counters on it, we can cast the discarded card without paying its mana cost. So essentially, whenever Malcolm deals combat damage, we get to loot a card, draw a card, discard a card. And if Malcolm then connected 4 times and he does have the 4 chorus counters, we don't even lose the discarded card anymore. Even better, we just get to cast it for free. And as you will see later in this video, we do play a couple of other cards in the deck that will allow us to put chorus counters on Malcolm and get to the 4 chorus counters really fast. And aside from that great ability, it's just a really cheap and efficient flash flying creature that you can drop before you even play Sonic. Then on a later turn, whenever you drop Sonic and you start swinging with him, the power and toughness of this creature will grow and you will be dealing a huge amount of damage to your opponents. Snapcaster Mage, one of my personal favorite magic cards ever printed. For 2 mana, you get a 2/1 flash body that whenever it enters a battlefield will give an instant or sorcery card in your graveyard flashback until the end of turn. Meaning that you can cast a spell from your graveyard by just paying its mana cost. When you do, that spell does get exiled. So first up, and the most obvious, you do get a really cheap and efficient flash creature body that you can start growing with the +1/+1 counters from Sonic. And whenever this creature gets into combat or an opponent deals damage to it, it will generate you treasure tokens. And the flashback ability on this creature is just absolutely ridiculous, especially in this type of deck. Since we are in Jeskai colors, we don't really play that much graveyard recursion, and we will always have really valuable instants and sorceries in our graveyard. As you will see later in the interaction and protection section of this deck, we do play a ton of counter magic, removal spells, bounce spells, tutors, even some instants and sorceries that we use as game finishers. And you can use a Snapcaster Mage to recur any of these cards from your graveyard, just allowing you to get a second use of them. Snapcaster Mage will always grant you excellent value. Devilish Fillet, a 3 mana 1/3 trample haste creature. And whenever another creature enters a battlefield under our control, we get to double Devilish Fillet's power. Now I know this ability doesn't seem all that impressive when you take into account its 1 base power. But since this creature has haste, you can actually start stacking counters on him with Sonic, sort of boosting its base stats. Let's say you are able to get 2 +1/+1 counters on this creature, it will now be at 3 power. If you then can, for example, play 3 creatures, it will go to 6 power, 12 power, 24 power. And this effect can get out of control really quickly, since we do play a ton of cards in this deck that actually allow us to create a ton of creature tokens. You already saw Ardos, the first card, in this video, and you will see a couple of token generators later in this video. Just imagine having this card on the battlefield and then generating 10 creature tokens, actually getting 10 triggers out of this card and doubling its power 10 times. It will just end up with like a gazillion power, and thanks to this card actually having haste and more importantly trample, you will instantly be able to take an opponent out of the game with an attack. Not too shabby for a 3-drop creature. Gognog, the Red Reaper. This 3 mana creature has some of the most unique and flavorful abilities out of any card I've ever seen. First up, passively, cowards can block warriors. Now, what does that even mean? Whenever 1 or more warriors we control attack a player, we get to pick target creature that player controls and turn it into a coward. Now, a creature becoming a coward doesn't do anything special, it will just have an extra type saying coward. And thanks to Gornok's first ability, those creatures won't be able to block either Gornok or any of your other warrior creatures anymore. And Gornok's last ability will give all attacking warriors you control plus X power, X being the total amount of cowards that your opponents control, providing with a really solid stat boost for all the warriors you play in this deck. And speaking about warriors, yes, Sonic also is a warrior. Don't ask me why, but he does have the typing. And in total, we do play a total of 8 warriors in this deck, including Gornok. So Gornok is a really solid haste body that will make some of your creatures harder to block and will give a solid stat boost to some of the creatures in this deck. And honestly, this is just a really flavorful ability, just turning some of your opponent's commanders into cowards and them being scared of blocking your warriors. I just really like this card. Kilo, Apogee Mind, a new legendary artifact creature we just just got in the Edge of Eternity set. For 3 mana you get a 3/3 haste body, and whenever Kilo gets tapped we get to proliferate. Meaning we get to pick any number of permanents and players and give them another counter of any counter they already have. And as you can imagine, with Sonic's counter ability, this is just absolutely insane. Let's say you have Sonic, Kilo and 3 other creatures on the battlefield. Then you decide to swing with all 5 of your creatures and you will get 2 triggers on the stack. The first being Sonic's trigger, allowing you to put a +1/+1 counter on every creature with haste or flash. And the second will be Kilo's proliferate trigger. Since you do control both triggers, you can choose in which order you want these to resolve. Obviously, you will want to resolve the Sonic trigger first, putting a +1/+1 counter on all 5 of your creatures. Then you will get to resolve the Kilo trigger and you can proliferate. You will pick all 5 of your creatures and put an additional +1/+1 counter on them. So instead of giving a +5/+5 stat boost to your entire board whenever you swing, you now get to double up on that stat boost. The synergy between Kilo and Sonic is absolutely ridiculous, and especially the fact that Kilo has haste himself makes this absolutely crazy. And as I already mentioned when I was talking about Malcolm, we can actually use Kilo's proliferate ability to double up on the amount of chorus counters that we would put on Malcolm. So whenever you have Malcolm and Kilo on the field, you just have to swing with them in 2 turns and Malcolm will get a total of 4 chorus counters, enabling the full potential of his ability. Kranko, Baron of Tin Street. A 3 mana haste goblin creature with 2 really interesting abilities that combines goblins and artifacts. And let's start by talking about its last ability. Whenever an artifact is put into your graveyard, you get the ability to pay 1 red mana. When you do, you get to create a 1/1 goblin token and that token will get haste until the end of turn. Now obviously this isn't an artifact deck, but Kranko does have some crazy interactions with treasure tokens. Because you can tap one of your treasure tokens to add 1 red mana to your mana pool, the treasure token will hit the graveyard and you will instantly be able to use the 1 red mana to activate Kranko. As you will see later in this video, in this deck you will have the ability to generate a huge amount of treasure tokens. Sometimes you will be even generating this many treasures that you don't have the ability to use the mana they produce. And this version of Kranko then just gives you a perfect out for your treasure tokens, just converting them into an army of goblins. And since on the turn these goblins come down, they will have haste. When you then swing with these creatures and Sonic, they will all get a +1/+1 counter. And on top of that, you can also tap Kranko to sacrifice any artifact and you will get to put a +1/+1 counter on each other goblin you control, growing your goblin army even more. I've always been wanting to use this version of Kranko in a deck that I built, and I honestly think that this Sonic deck is the perfect home for him. Laelia, the Blade Reforged. Whenever you attack with this haste creature, you get to exile the top card of your library, and you are allowed to play that card for the remainder of this turn. What this card essentially does is give you some sort of pseudo card advantage, because you will get access to 1 extra card every turn you swing with her, but if you don't play that card, you will lose it in exile forever. And you can play lands with this effect, or you can cast spells with this effect. Now, while this sort of exile card advantage is really fantastic, you will want to change your playstyle whenever you do have Laelia on the battlefield, because in most cases you will be wanting to swing with her first before you spend all your mana or you play your land for the turn. Because if Laelia exiles one of your really big game winning spells and you already tapped all your mana, you will lose it in exile forever. And if you hit a land with Laelia and you already played a land this turn, it will also be lost in exile forever. So swing first and cast or play later. And our last ability allows us to put a +1/+1 counter on this creature whenever we exile a card from our library or our graveyard. Her attack trigger will give her counters, and whenever we flashback something with a Snapcaster Mage, for example, and we exile that spell from our graveyard, we will also get to put a counter on it. Now, while the counter stacking of Laelia might not be that impressive, if you actually combine this with the amount of counters that Sonic will put on her, Laelia will turn into a really huge creature body really fast, and your opponents will have to deal with it at some point. Screaming Nemesis, a 3 mana haste spirit we got in the Duskborn set. Whenever Screaming Nemesis is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target. So whenever someone is blocking this creature, it will allow you to ping damage equal to the blocking creature's power to any target, usually allowing you to remove any problematic creature on the board or the creature that blocked the Screaming Nemesis. Or whenever you decide to shoot this damage at a player's face, that player can't gain life anymore for the rest of the game. And this effect does have the ability to shut down an entire deck. In my playgroup, I have someone playing a Karlov life gain deck and someone playing a Hope Esteem life gain mill deck. If I can then just ping 1 damage to them with a Screaming Nemesis, the game is just over for them because they can't ever gain life anymore. And this effect can be removed. It's just on you as a player forever. And as you will see later in this video, we do play a ton of effects that ping 1 damage to each creature on the table. When we can then redirect this 1 damage to a player with Screaming Nemesis, the life gain is just over. Eowyn, Fearless Knight, a 4 mana 3/4 haste creature. And whenever she enters the battlefield, we get to exile target creature an opponent controls that has a greater power than this card. And on top of that, all legendary creatures we control will gain protection of that exiled creature's colors until the end of the turn. So it's a haste body that also acts as a removal spell, and that can give our legendary creatures protection, essentially making them some sort of unblockable by that color. Usually whenever I resolve this card, I can just use this to remove someone's commander, and since removing a player's commander will always give you protection of all the colors they play in that deck, you can just essentially make all your legendary creatures unblockable by any of that player's creatures. And this is just a massive tempo swing because their commander will be removed and you will be able to hit them for a huge amount of damage. Knuckles the Echidna, another creature from the same secret lair as Sonic. And I'm gonna be honest, Knuckles just seems like a really broken card, and not just for this deck, but for any deck that splashes red. For 4 mana, you get a 2/4 double strike trample haste body, which honestly is already a really good stat line with some really good keywords. And this card has the same passive effect as a Professional Facebreaker, a really popular card that sees play in a ton of commander decks. Whenever 1 or more creatures deals combat damage to a player, you get to create a treasure token. And as you can imagine, in a deck that relies on swinging with creatures, this will provide some excellent mana acceleration. And just like with a Professional Facebreaker, since this card says whenever 1 or more, it doesn't matter how many creatures you actually deal combat damage with to an opponent. If you hit him with 1 creature or 3 creatures, you will just get to generate 1 treasure. But if you do swing 3 creatures at 3 different opponents, you will get 1 treasure generated per player that gets hit. And since Knuckles does have double strike, he will actually deal combat damage in 2 instances. Once in the first strike damage step and once in the normal strike damage step, allowing you to generate 2 treasure tokens whenever you can connect with Knuckles. And those keywords and ability alone already make for a fantastic creature, but on top of that he also has an alternative win con attached to it, kinda similar to a Hellkite Tyrant. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you do control 30 or more artifacts, you just win the game. Now getting to 30 artifacts by just using Knuckles' ability is a really hard thing to do. But keep in mind, we do have Sonic in the command zone, which is basically like a treasure generating engine. Just get a couple of haste creatures on the field, play a couple of damage ping effects, and you will be spawning a million treasure tokens. If you then control these treasures, you get to your next upkeep and you have a Knuckles on the field, you will just instantly win the game. Not the most fun way to win a game in my opinion, but if it works, it works. Thundering Raiju. For 4 mana, you get a 3/3 haste creature that whenever it attacks allows you to put 1+1/+1 counter on any creature you control. Then, Thundering Raiju will deal X damage to each opponent, X being the total amount of other modified creatures you control. And a modified creature is any creature that has equipment, an aura, or +1/+1 counters on it. Now let me tell you, Thundering Raiju really does some work in a Sonic deck. Because once again, let's say you control a total of 5 creatures, one being a Thunderous Raiju and Sonic. You then decide to swing with all 5 of your creatures and you will get a Sonic trigger and a Raiju trigger. You control both triggers and you decide decide how you want to stack them. You decide to resolve the Sonic trigger first and you get to put a +1/+1 counter on all your creatures. Then you go to the Raiju trigger, you put a +1/+1 counter on a random creature you control, and then you get to deal a total of 5 damage to each opponent because you are swinging with 5 modified creatures, resulting in a total of 15 damage for doing what you are planning on doing anyways, just swinging with your creatures and Sonic. Sonic will ensure all creatures you control are modified, and Thundering Raiju will then translate that into a huge amount of damage. Aurelia, the Law Above, a 5 mana 4/4 flying vigilance haste angel. And whenever any player attacks with 3 or more creatures, we get to draw a card. Now, as you can imagine, in this type of deck, most of our turns we will be swinging with 3 or more creatures, and Aurelia will then just give us a really consistent source of card draw. But because of how this ability is worded, whenever any of your opponents decide to attack with 3 or more creatures, we also get to draw a card, giving you some card advantage whenever your opponents are attacking each other or whenever they're swinging their creatures at you. And whenever you or an opponent decides to attack with 5 or more creatures at once, Aurelia will deal 3 damage to each opponent and we will get to gain 3 life. Just an awesome effect that will slowly drain out the table and will give you some life gain so you can stay in the game for longer. If you do play in a creature heavy pot or there are some token players, Aurelia is just a fantastic inclusion in any deck. Over the course of the game, she will just generate you a huge amount of value. Goldspan Dragon. Whenever this 5 mana flying haste creature attacks or becomes the target of a spell, we get to generate a treasure token. Thanks to the haste, this creature will generate you value immediately from the turn it comes down because you will instantly be able to swing with it. And if your opponents are trying to target this card with any sort of spot removal or bounce effect, it will also generate you value in the form of extra treasure tokens. But the main reason why this card is included in the deck is its passive ability. All treasure tokens we control will now get a new line of text. We can tap them, sacrifice them, and add 2 mana of any color to our mana pool. And what this effect essentially does is just allow us to double up on any amount of mana that any of our treasure tokens would produce. 5 treasure tokens will now generate you 10 mana. Goldspan Dragon is just an excellent value creature that you can include in any treasure-based deck. Iron Man, Titan of Innovation. And like I mentioned, Magic is getting absolutely crazy. If you would have told me even 1 year ago that I would be playing a deck that had Sonic the Hedgehog as my commander and Iron Man in the 99, I would have never believed you. That being said, Iron Man is a 5 mana flying haste creature that whenever he attacks, he will generate you a treasure token. Already in itself some really excellent mana acceleration. And after we created the treasure token, we also get the ability to sacrifice a non-creature artifact. When we do, we get to search our library for any artifact card with the mana cost of the sacrificed artifact +1. And then we get to put that selected artifact straight onto the battlefield. And Iron Man basically is some sort of a birthing pot on a stick that triggers whenever you attack with it. Now this ability obviously is very strong. Like I mentioned, we aren't an artifact deck, but even in this deck we do use Iron Man to tutor up some of the key artifacts we play in this deck. And we can even tutor up some of them by just sacrificing treasure tokens. And I will be explaining these synergies whenever I get to the artifacts that we actually want to tutor up with Iron Man. But what you should know for now is that Iron Man is just an awesome flying haste body that synergizes perfectly with Sonic. Sephiroth, the Fallen Hero. For 5 mana, you get a 7/5 creature that has an insane ability for any sort of modified creatures. Whenever Sephiroth attacks, we get to put a cell counter on target creature. Now this cell counter doesn't do anything, but any creature with a cell counter on it does count as a modified creature. Now obviously in this deck we don't really need the cell counter since we will be stacking +1/+1 counters on everything by using Sonic. And then after you place the cell counter until the end of turn, each modified creature you control gets base stat 7/5 until the end of turn. And yeah, this is just absolutely insane when you combine it with Sonic. Because let's say you have 3 really cheap haste creatures on the board, you can then just attack with Sonic and this creature, resolve the Sonic trigger first, give all of them a +1/+1 counter, then Sephiroth will trigger, they will get base stats 7/5, but on top of that they will still be boosted by any sort of counters they had on them, turning them into 8/6 bodies if they only had the 1 counter. And Sonic obviously will also have his base stats increased to 7/5 because whenever Sonic attacks he will always be giving a counter to himself. And if that ability didn't sell you on Sephiroth, he even has an additional activated ability. For 3 generic mana and sacrificing any modified creature we control, we get to return Sephiroth from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Yeah, in this deck you will always have a modified creature to sacrifice and you can just keep recurring Sephiroth until he gets exiled. And you can even do this on instant speed, so if you do have 3 mana left at the end of an opponent's turn, you can just return him in an opponent's turn. It's your turn again, your upkeep, you get to untap him and you can instantly swing with him again. Somewhat working around the summoning sickness. Sephiroth really is one of my favorite cards in this entire deck. Aurelia the War Leader, a massive 6 mana 3/4 flying vigilance haste body. And whenever Aurelia attacks for the first time this turn, we get to untap all creatures we control and we get an additional combat phase after this one. The 2 combat phases will basically allow us to deal a huge amount of damage to any opponent if we are ahead on the board. And the second combat phase also allows us to get another Sonic trigger when we attack with him and give additional +1/+1 counters to all our haste or flash creatures. Aurelia is an excellent creature to just close out the game with in this type of deck. Cavern Horde Dragon, a massive 9 mana flying trample haste creature, but the cost of this creature is reduced by the greatest amount of artifacts that an opponent controls. Now in my experience you will usually be able to cast this huge dragon for just 4 or 5 mana in most games. And if you play against a token player that relies on creating treasures, food or clue tokens, just casting this creature for 2 red mana is an absolutely insane deal. And whenever this creature deals combat damage to an opponent, you get to generate a treasure token for each artifact that player controls. And since nowadays a ton of people are actually playing mana rocks and cards that generate treasure tokens for themselves, this effect will always give you excellent treasure generation. Cavern Horde Dragon is just a really huge creature body with haste that you can usually cast for a really low cost. Tempt with Vengeance, a sorcery spell that will cost you 1 red mana plus X. And whenever you cast this, you get to create X 1/1 red elemental tokens with haste. Then each opponent may decide to also create that many elemental tokens with haste. When they do, we get to create that many elemental tokens once again. So let's say you cast this for a total of 6 mana, you will then get to generate 5 tokens. Let's say opponent 1 and 2 don't want to generate these tokens, but opponent 3 also wants these 5 elemental tokens. We then get another 5 and we get a total of 10 of these haste tokens, which is some really good value for just 6 mana. And obviously the synergies these tokens have with Sonic are absolutely insane, because whenever you then swing with Sonic, these creatures will get a +1/+1 counter and they will be growing over the course of the game. And if your opponents don't have any way to deal with these tokens, eventually they will grow into huge creature bodies that will just win you the game. And if your opponents do decide to block these creatures whenever they take damage because they have haste and you have Sonic on the field, they will generate you treasure tokens. So no matter what your opponents do decide to do, you will always get a huge amount of value from these haste tokens. And later in the game, if you just cast an AoE damage spell and Sonic just generated you a gazillion treasure tokens, you can just use all of these treasure tokens, pump it in the spell, and you will be able to make a huge army of haste elemental tokens. A perfect card both in the earlier stages of the game to just get some haste bodies on the field or to just close out the game with. And the last card in this section is Fort Eorlingas. For a white, a red and X mana, you get to create X 2/2 trample haste tokens. And this card is fantastic in this deck for the same reasons as I mentioned with the previous card. You can just use this earlier in the game to get some 2/2 tokens with haste on the battlefield. You can then grow these over the course of the game by attacking with Sonic and using his counter ability. And whenever your opponents do decide to deal with them by dealing damage to them or blocking them, they will generate you treasure tokens. And in the late game, whenever you do have a huge amount of mana available to you by Sonic's treasure generation, if you can generate enough of these creature tokens, they will win you the game. Especially since these creatures also have trample, so your opponents can't actually just use 1/1 tokens to chump block these. They will always be taking combat damage. And on top of that, the turn you cast a spell and one of your creatures dealt combat damage to an opponent, you also become the Monarch. And the Monarch will draw a card at the beginning beginning of the end step, essentially making this card into some sort of a cantrip that will replace itself by drawing you a card. And if your opponents don't have a way to deal damage to you and take the Monarch emblem from you, it will even draw you more cards. If you're enjoying these in-depth deck tech videos and you want to support me or the channel, check out the YouTube membership program. You get early access to the deck lists for any of these videos before the videos even go live. You get some awesome Panzer MTG emojis you can use anywhere on Discord and YouTube, and you'll get access to some exclusive chat rooms in the Panzer MTG Discord server. And let me tell you, the Discord has gotten really active lately. We have people sharing their deck lists, we have people discussing MTG finance, and we also have a lot of people in the Gym Talk channel. So if you want to be a part of that community and help the channel grow, click the join button below the video or check the link in the description. Next up, we have the ring droppers. These cards allow us to ping damage to all creatures on the table and essentially allow our creatures to drop rings in the form of treasure tokens. Why wait for our creatures to take damage when we can start generating rings for ourselves? And obviously, since these cards will deal damage to everything on the table, they are just excellent to take out any tokens or mana dorks your opponents might control. Fire Magic, a new instant speed spell we got in the Final Fantasy set. And this card has the tiered mechanic, meaning whenever we cast this, we have to choose one additional cost this card has. For 1 mana, it will deal 1 damage to each creature. For 3 mana, it will deal 2 damage to each creature. And for 6 mana, it will deal a total of 3 damage to each creature. Now, usually 95% of the time, you will just be casting this for 1 mana. And then for that 1 mana on instant speed, you get to create a tapped treasure token for each creature you control whenever you have Sonic on the field, which, like all the other cards in this section, is just some absolutely insane value. And later in the game, if you do want to deal with some 2 or 3 toughness creatures on the board, I suppose you can invest more mana into this spell. Tremor. For 1 mana, you get to deal 1 damage to each creature that doesn't have flying. This card is basically the previous card Fire Magic, but without any of the options. That being said, generating a huge amount of treasure tokens for just the 1 red mana is always gonna be a really good deal. Spiteful Banditry. Probably one of my favorite ways in the entire deck to actually deal damage to your own creatures. For 2 red mana plus X, you get an enchantment that whenever it enters the battlefield will deal X damage to each creature on the board. So essentially, by just investing 3 mana into this enchantment, you can deal 1 damage to each creature on the board and start generating you treasures with Sonic. And on top of that, for as long as this enchantment stays on the board, whenever 1 or more creatures your opponents control would die, you get to create a treasure token. This ability only triggers once per turn. And you'd actually be amazed over the course of a game how many creatures actually do die every single turn. Usually whenever I had this card on the battlefield per turn cycle, it generated me an extra 3 to 4 treasure tokens. The effect is just absolutely crazy. A very underrated card in my opinion. Caltrops, a 3 mana artifact that will deal 1 damage to any creature whenever it attacks. And as you can imagine, this card is just absolutely broken when you combine it with Sonic. Since most of our turns we will just be swinging with like 5 creatures that have Flash or Haste, and whenever we then have Caltrops on the field, it will deal 1 damage to each of our creatures, and we will get to generate a tapped treasure token for each creature we control. And even if we do have some 1 toughness creature that would normally die to the effect of Caltrops, we can just resolve the Sonic trigger first, give it a +1/+1 counter, boost it to 2 toughness, and then take the Caltrops trigger. By far one of the best cards in the entire deck. If you do decide to build a deck around Sonic as a commander, you will always have to include Caltrops. It's just way too good not to play. And this effect also works against your opponent's creatures. Let's say you're playing against a Chatterfang player and they just made infinite 1/1 squirrel tokens. They can't win the game anymore, because when they swing with their infinite 1/1 squirrel tokens, they will take 1 damage before they actually deal damage, just removing them from the game. And also a nifty little trick, as you will see later in this video, we do play a couple of 2 mana rocks in this deck. And later in the game, if you then do have an Iron Man on the field and you attack with him, you can actually sacrifice one of these 2 mana rocks to go fetch up your Caltrops straight from your deck. Pyrohemia, a 4 mana enchantment with an activated ability. For 1 red mana, Pyrohemia will deal 1 damage to each creature and each player. And as you can imagine, this card essentially just reads pay 1 red mana and generate 1 tapped treasure token for each creature you control. The fact that you can just keep repeating this effect and just keep generating a huge amount of treasure tokens every time you do so is just absolutely ridiculous. Do keep in mind though, don't forget to look at your creature's total toughness, because at some point after activating Pyrohemia a couple of times you will actually start killing your own creatures. You will still get the treasure tokens, but you will start losing bodies. And at the end of turn, if no creatures are in play, you do have to sacrifice this enchantment. In most cases you won't be using Pyrohemia to actually clear the board, but if an opponent does use a board wipe, this effect might actually become really relevant. We also use Pyrohemia in one of our infinite combos, but I will be getting into that later in the video. And once again, like I mentioned with the previous card, if you are gonna build a Sonic deck, you will always have to include Pyrohemia. It's just way too good of a synergy with Sonic. And the last card in this section is Slice and Dice. For 6 mana, you get a sorcery card that deals 4 damage to each creature. Now I'm gonna be honest, I have never ever cast this card for 6 mana in this deck. I suppose in some really weird situations late in the game you can use it as some sort of a board wipe, but this card is included in the deck for its cycle ability. For 3 mana you can cycle this card, meaning you discard it from your hand and you get to draw a new card. And whenever you cycle it, it will deal 1 damage to each creature. So it's not as efficient as the 1 mana cards that ping 1 damage to the entire table, but in return it does draw a card, basically replacing itself. And since we use this card's cycle ability, which is actually an activated ability, opponents can't use counter magic to actually counter the 1 damage. So if you do play in a pot where a lot of control magic is being played, cycle abilities are really hard for control players to actually deal with. Next up we have the support cards. And these are the cards that push Sonic from a really cute and fun deck to a real value engine. They double our counters, turn our treasures into damage, or give us additional benefits from the treasures we are generating. Amulet of Vigor. Whenever this 1 mana artifact is on the battlefield, whenever any permanent would enter the battlefield tapped under our control, we get to untap it. And this card is included in the deck for the sole reason that Sonic will generate us tapped treasure tokens. When you have an Amulet of Vigor on the battlefield and you do decide to ping 1 damage to all your creatures, you will get untapped treasure tokens instead, allowing you to instantly utilize the treasure tokens you just generated to just follow up with more and more value. The tempo you get from this card and the instant treasure usage is just insane. And we also use Amulet of Vigor in an infinite combo in this deck. And for this combo you will need a couple of things. You'll need Sonic on the battlefield, any other creature on the battlefield, an Amulet of Vigor, a Pyrohemia, and a way to give your creatures indestructible. First up, you start by using the effect to actually give all your creatures indestructible, and in this deck you can use 3 cards: a Boros Charm, Spectacular Spider-Man, or Flawless Maneuver. Then you activate Pyrohemia by paying 1 red mana, and this will deal 1 damage to each creature on the battlefield. Since Sonic and your other creature are dealt damage, you will get to generate 2 treasure tokens. Amulet of Vigor will trigger and it will untap those 2 generated treasure tokens. And you can tap one of those 2 treasure tokens to add 1 red mana to your mana pool and activate Pyrohemia again, dealing damage again, generating you 2 treasures again, and then you can just keep repeating the loop for as long as your life total allows it, because every time you do use Pyrohemia, it will also deal 1 damage to you as a player. So you can keep repeating this until you hit 1 life, otherwise you would just lose the game. And what this sort of loop will do then is deal 1 damage to every creature on the board repeatedly. Every time you go through the loop you will net 1 treasure token, giving you access to a huge amount of mana, and your opponents will also take 1 damage each time you activate Pyrohemia. So usually you can just use this combo to take your opponents down to a really low life total, clear the board by the 1 damage pinging to all of their creatures, or you can use the huge amount of mana generated by your treasure tokens to just cast 1 of your X spells, generate a huge amount of creature tokens, and just win the game on the spot. And another really cool thing in this deck is that whenever you swing with Iron Man, you get to generate a treasure token. You can then instantly sacrifice the generated treasure token and go fetch up an Amulet of Vigor straight from your deck, meaning you then only need to draw into a Pyrohemia and an indestructibility spell to just start this combo. Talking about finding combo pieces, Enlightened Tutor. For 1 white mana, you get to search your library for any artifact or enchantment card and put it on top of your deck. Now, the main reason why this card is included in the deck is to just go fetch up the Pyrohemia or the Amulet of Vigor, whichever piece you need for the combo. And like I mentioned, even if you're not going for the combo, Pyrohemia is still a really good card in this deck, even if you aren't using it for any sort of combo. It will always generate you a huge amount of treasures and deal a huge amount of damage. And as you will see later in this video, we do run a ton of really other unique enchantments and artifacts that you can just use this tutor card for to go tutor them up. Everything depends on the board state you are currently in. You can use this early in the game to just go fetch up a Ristic Study. You can use this to go tutor up a Kilo to start proliferating. Or you can use this to go fetch up an Alchemist Talent and turn your treasure tokens into table-wide damage. Great Train Heist. This red instant speed spell has the spree mechanic, meaning whenever we cast it, we get to choose 1 or more additional costs. The first ability allows us to untap all creatures we control, and if we cast this spell in a combat phase, we get an additional combat phase after this one. Like I mentioned when talking about Aurelia, extra combat phases in this deck are just excellent with Sonic, allowing your creatures to get blocked again, generate you more treasures, and allowing you to put more +1/+1 counters on all creatures you control. For 2 generic mana, we can also give all our creatures +1, 0, and first strike until the end of turn. Pretty good to boost the power of your creatures if you are actually about to deal combat damage. Just keep in mind, whenever your creatures deal first strike damage and they destroy their blocking creatures, they won't be taking damage themselves and you won't be generating treasure tokens. So first strike isn't the best keyword in this deck. And for just 1 extra red mana, we get to choose an opponent. And whenever a creature we control deals damage to that opponent, we get to generate a tapped treasure token for each creature that deals damage to them. Usually whenever you cast a spell, you will have the 1 mana around to pay this additional cost, and whenever you combine this with the additional combat phase, you will be able to generate an insane amount of treasure tokens, because the opponent will be selected in the first combat phase to generate you extra treasures, and in the second combat phase, just allowing you to generate double the amount. The Great Train Heist is one of the more versatile red cards printed in Modern Magic, and versatility is what makes Magic cards good. Krark Clan Shaman, a 1 mana 1/1 goblin with an activated ability. We can choose to sacrifice an artifact on instant speed and he will deal 1 damage to each creature without flying. Now I know this creature does seem really weird in the deck, because whenever you sacrifice an artifact, you will deal a ton of damage to the table, generate you a ton of treasure tokens by combining it with Sonic, but he will also deal 1 damage to himself. And since he doesn't have Flash or Haste, he will actually destroy himself in the process, because we can't use Sonic to stack counters on him. Now honestly, the only reason I did decide to include Krark Clan Shaman in this deck is because it is used in an infinite combo. And for the combo to work, you just need the following things. You need a creature with Flash or Haste on the battlefield, you need Sonic on the battlefield, you need the Shaman on the battlefield, and you need to have a spell that grants indestructible to creatures you control, which, as I mentioned before, in this deck can be Spectacular Spider-Man, Flawless Maneuver, or Boros Charm. And you will also need at least 1 artifact on the battlefield, and this can be anything. A mana rock, a treasure token, doesn't matter. First, you will start by giving all your creatures indestructible by casting any of the 3 indestructibility spells in this deck. Then you activate the Shaman by sacrificing an artifact and he will deal 1 damage to each creature on the board without flying. You will then get 2 Sonic triggers because 2 creatures with Haste or Flash will take damage. This will then generate you that many tapped treasure tokens, and then you can start repeating the loop by just sacrificing the tapped treasure tokens to the Shaman. Now, like the first combo, this combo doesn't guarantee you an instant game win, but it will deal infinite damage to all creatures on the board without flying, and it will generate you infinite tapped treasure tokens. So it will clear the board, and whenever you get to untap, you will have infinite mana. Honestly, a really easy combo to pull off, and even if you don't manage to pull off the combo, you can just use this creature as some sort of a Tremors effect. The only difference being that you will have to sacrifice an artifact to get the 1 damage. damage. But we will have treasure tokens laying around anyways. Reconnaissance, a 1 mana enchanted with an activated ability for 0 mana. Whenever you activate the ability, you get to remove an attacking creature you control from combat and you also get to untap it. The main reason why this card is in the deck is because you will want to be swinging with Sonic every single turn. And sometimes your opponents will just have some huge blockers on the board and you won't be able to connect with them. This way you do have a way to actually start growing your board without losing Sonic. And this card is also just excellent against combat tricks. Let's say you swing with your entire board at an opponent and they then decide to activate their Vault of the Archangel, giving all their blockers death touch. You can just use Reconnaissance as many times as you want, just remove all your creatures from combat and untap them. And all your creatures will be fine. Reconnaissance also gives your creature some sort of pseudo vigilance, because you can attack with all your creatures, they can deal damage, and at the end of the combat step you can just remove them from combat and they will be untapped again, so you will be able to use them as a blocker later. Reconnaissance is one of those crazy old 1 mana enchantments that have a really weird but really efficient effect. Lazael, Vlaakith's champion. For as long as this creature is on the battlefield, if you would put any number of counters on a creature you control, you get to put that many counters on them plus 1 instead. And this card and Sonic are just a match made in heaven. Because whenever you attack with Sonic, instead of just giving your entire board 1+1+1 counter, you will now give him 2 instead, just doubling up on your counter production in this deck. And like proliferating, Lazael also works for any type of counter. So she will double the chorus counters you put on Malcolm, she will double the counters that Krenko produces on any goblins you might control, and even gives Lelia 2 counters whenever she exiles a card. A really efficient creature that will double all counters we produce in this deck for just 3 mana. Professional Facebreaker, the baby version of Knuckles. For 3 mana you get a 2/3 menace creature, and whenever 1 or more creatures deal combat damage to an opponent, you get to create a treasure token. Now this effect in itself is already really good and will generate you a ton of mana over the course of a game. But the main reason why this card is included in the deck is its last activated ability. We can sacrifice a treasure token to exile the top card of our library, and we get to play that card until the end of the turn. Now, as you can imagine, in this type of deck, whenever you have Sonic on the field and you start pinging damage with a Pyrohemia, for example, to the entire board, you will generate an absurd amount of treasure tokens. This will give you access to a ton of mana, but if you don't have cards in your hand, you actually have no use for the mana. With a Professional Facebreaker, you can then just start sacrificing your treasure tokens to just dig into your deck for any card you might need. A fantastic way later in the game to turn your gazillion treasure tokens into actual card advantage. Alchemist's Talent, a 4 mana class card. Whenever this enchantment enters the battlefield, you get to generate 2 tapped treasure tokens. Some sort of an investment to just accelerate your mana. And whenever you invest 2 mana into this card, which you can do by using the 2 tapped treasure tokens this card generated, you will get access to its second ability, functioning in the same way that a Goldspan Dragon would. Instead of your treasure tokens generating you 1 mana, they will now generate you 2 mana instead. And just doubling up on any sort of mana that your treasure tokens would produce in this deck is absolutely crazy, because we have a really easy time generating a ton of treasure tokens thanks to Sonic. And whenever you get this class to its last level by spending 5 more mana on it, you get an enchantment that actually helps you turn your treasure tokens into damage you can actually close out games with. Whenever you cast any spell that mana from a treasure token was used for, you get to deal damage to each opponent equal to the mana value of the spell you just cast. And later in the game, the damage on this type of effect really adds up. If you start using your treasures to cast any of your cantrips, your ping effects, your creatures, whatever, if your opponents have no way to deal with this enchantment, it will eventually just burn them out of the game. Alchemist's Talent really is one of my favorite treasure-based cards. Gogo, Mysterious Mime. At the beginning of combat on our turn, we may have Gogo turn into a copy of any creature we control until the end of the turn, but its name will still be Gogo Mysterious Mime. And this is really relevant because it does allow you to bypass the legend rule. You can use Gogo to create a copy out of Sonic, and since both cards aren't named Sonic, you actually get to keep both. And on top of that, both Gogo and the creature you did decide to copy will get +2/0 and haste until the end of turn. A nice little stat boost, and the haste will enable you to instantly get some value from Gogo the turn he comes down and boost it up with Sonic. Now obviously Gogo does have a million uses in this deck, so just let me give you some examples. You can copy Sonic with this and you will get to put double the amount of +1/+1 counters on all your creatures. And whenever a creature now takes damage, you get to generate 2 tap treasure tokens. You can copy Iron Man and start generating even more treasures and tutoring even more artifacts out of your deck. You can copy Kilo and start proliferating twice. You can copy an Aurelia and start drawing even more cards. The amount of things you can do with Gogo in this deck are just endless. One of my favorite cards from the entire Final Fantasy set. And the last card in this section is Herald of Secret Streams, a 4-mana merfolk with a really simple ability. Creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them can't be blocked. And what this ability basically means in this deck is that any creature you control with haste or flash will be unblockable. Just start scaling up your board by swinging with Sonic, drop this creature, and your opponents won't have any way to block any of your attackers. And usually whenever you drop this creature, you are instantly able to take one opponent out of the game with it. And obviously you don't want to be swinging with this creature itself because we don't actually have any ways to give him +1/+1 counters because he doesn't have flash or haste. Next up we have the acceleration section. Even though we will be able to generate a ton of mana with our treasure tokens whenever we have Sonic on the battlefield, we still do want ways in this deck to get Sonic out as early as possible. This section mainly consists of really simple mana rocks that just allow us to smooth out our curve and fix our colors. Sol Ring, one of the most efficient mana rocks ever printed. For 1 mana you get an artifact that taps for 2 colorless mana. And it just really helps us generate more mana and play our big spells way ahead of the curve. And I also really like the art Sol Ring got in the Sonic Secret Lair. We also play 4 2-mana mana rocks in this deck, being 1 Arcane Signet and 3 of the Talismans. Dropping any of these 4 cards on turn 2 will allow you to play Sonic as early as turn 3 and start generating huge amounts of value. Charming Scoundrel, a 2-mana 1/1 creature with haste. And whenever she enters the battlefield, you get to choose 1 out of 3 options. The first option allows you to loot, basically discard a card and draw a card. An option you can use later in the game to discard any land cards you don't need to actually draw into a valuable card. The second option allows you to generate a treasure token, accelerating your mana. And the third option allows you to generate a Wicked Roll token and attach it to a creature you control. Wicked Roll token being a simple aura that will give a small stat boost to a creature. Now 99% of the time you will be using this creature to generate you a treasure token, and it's actually one of the best plays you can have on turn 2, because you will get a really early haste body that you can start growing with Sonic, and dropping this creature on turn 2, dropping you a treasure and dropping a land on turn 3 will allow you to cast Sonic as early as turn 3, which is just some really insane tempo. Deep Gnome Terramancer, a 2-mana creature with flash and a really awesome passive effect. Whenever 1 or more lands would enter the battlefield under an opponent's control without being played, we get to search our library for a Plains card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Now first up, a 2-mana flash body we can drop before we drop Sonic is already really good to start growing with Sonic later. And the passive ability can be absolutely ridiculous depending on your play group. Because whenever an opponent cracks a fetch land, we get to search our library for a Plains and accelerate our mana. Whenever an opponent plays an acceleration spell like a Farseek or a Kodama's Reach, we also get to ramp. So if you play in a pot with a ton of green players or landfall players, you'll just absolutely love this card. And you don't even have to use this effect to go fetch a basic Plains. You can fetch any land with the Plains typing, be it even a Shockland or a Triome. A really simple creature that can generate you a ton of value. And the last card in this section is Captain Lannery Storm. For 3 mana you get a haste body that whenever she attacks will generate you a treasure token. Just a simple haste body that will accelerate your mana every turn you attack with her. And on top of that, whenever you sacrifice a treasure token, she will also get +1 power until the end of turn, which might be relevant later in the game if you do need a couple of extra points of damage to actually close out the game. A quick detour to the dark corners of the internet. While making this video, I discovered that pregnant Sonic was a whole type of meme genre. Yeah, don't Google it, just trust me on this one. And recently I even saw an MTG pregnant Sonic meme with Zinnia Valley's voice. Because Zinnia gives all your creatures offspring, this sort of means you can have a pregnant Sonic in Magic. As I mentioned, Magic is getting really weird with all these universes beyond sets and some of the mechanics in Magic. Next up, we have the card draw section. With Sonic spitting out treasures every time any of our creatures take a hit, mana is almost never the problem in this deck. The real bottleneck is actually having cards in our hand to spend that mana on. That's why this card is stocked with card draw engines to just make sure the rings that Sonic produces whenever a creature gets hit never goes to waste. Archivist of Ogma, a 2-mana creature body with flash. And whenever an opponent would search their library, we get to gain 1 life and draw a card. So again, a really small creature you can just drop and start growing with Sonic later. And in an actual game of Commander, you'd be surprised by how many times opponents will be searching their decks. Someone plays a tutor, we get to draw. Someone cracks a fetch land, we get to draw. Someone plays an acceleration spell looking for a forest in their deck, we get to draw. Someone who's playing on a €10 budget is cracking their evolving wilds, we get to draw. Archivist of Ogma is one of the strongest creatures printed in white and you can run it in almost any deck. At first this card was an Esper Sentinel in this deck because it's obviously also an insane creature that will draw you a ton of cards, but I chose to play Archivist of Ogma over it because it is a flash body and is just better in synergizing with Sonic. Fairy Mastermind. For 2 mana you get a 2/1 flash body with flying, and passively whenever an opponent would draw their second card each turn, we also get to draw a card. Just having a flying creature with flash on the board that you can start growing with Sonic is already fantastic. And its passive ability will make sure that whenever your opponents are playing any of their card draw spells, you will also get to gain a benefit out of that. Someone playing a Brainstorm will draw you a card, someone playing a Sign in Blood will draw you a card, any sort of additional card draw your opponents will play will draw you cards as well. And on top of that, this card also has an activated ability for 4 mana that will allow each player to draw a card. And as I mentioned, later in the game you will be having access to huge amounts of mana by just generating treasure tokens. And whenever you can activate this ability twice in one single turn by using 8 mana for it, you will draw 2 cards of the effect yourself, and each opponent will also draw 2 cards in this turn, giving you an additional 3 cards. So for 8 mana you will be able to draw a total of 5 cards. Not the best deal, but if you do have a million treasures available to you and you have no cards in your hand, Fairy Mastermind is just a fantastic card for you. Mary, Esquire of Rohan. A cheap 2-mana creature with haste, and whenever this creature attacks together with another legendary creature, you get to draw a card. In this deck, speed is the name of the game and you can just drop this creature on turn 2, then on a later turn you will be casting Sonic and you will always be swinging with Sonic. Whenever you do so and you also include this creature in the attack, you will also get to draw a card, essentially giving you 1 extra card every single turn to work with. Pretty simple creature, but really solid value in this deck. Ristic Study. No, you pay the 1. I know, this card is annoying, it's really obnoxious, nobody likes it, but it is a really strong card. And since I already had 2 game changers in this deck, I just decided to go with the third one, being a Ristic Study. For the people who don't know Ristic Study yet, whenever an opponent plays any sort of spell, they have to pay 1 additional generic mana. When they don't, you just get to draw a card. And basically what this looks like in a game of Magic is per turn cycle, about like 4 to 10 spells will be cast, and Ristic Study will draw you like 4 to 10 cards per turn cycle, because no one likes paying 1 additional mana for every spell they cast. Sicarian Infiltrator, a 3 mana artifact creature with flash. And this creature also has the squat mechanic, meaning whenever we cast a spell, we can pay 2 generic mana any amount of times. When we do, this creature will enter with an additional token copy of itself for each time we pay the squat cost. And whenever this creature enters the battlefield, we get to draw a card. Now this is a really fantastic creature in a Sonic deck for a couple of reasons. First up, it's an artifact, meaning whenever we sacrifice one of our 2 mana rocks to Iron Man, we can actually go tutor this out of our deck, just giving us some extra card draw and an extra flash creature body. Second of all, this creature has flash, meaning it is a body that will generate us treasures whenever it takes damage, and we can grow it over time with Sonic. And the main reason this card is in the deck is obviously its squad mechanic. If you are able to generate an army of these flash creature tokens later in the game, you can start growing them with Sonic and they will just take over the game by themselves. And if your opponents do decide to block them, they will generate you a huge amount of treasure tokens. And a thing to consider with this card is that whenever you generate a gazillion treasure tokens by using Sonic, you will be able to create a ton of these creature tokens by just paying the squad cost a couple of times. If you can, for example, pay it 10 times, you will be drawing 10 cards of this, allowing you to dig really deep into your deck and just look for cards to close out the actual game with. Windfall. For 3 mana, each player has to discard their entire hand, and then each player will draw cards equal to the greatest amount of cards discarded this way. Yeah, what should I say? Windfall is just one of the best card draw spells ever printed. Early in the game, you can just empty your hand by playing your lands, your cheap haste creatures, curving out into Sonic. If you're then stuck with 2 cards into your hand, you can just cast a Windfall. Everyone has to discard. If an opponent then still had 6 cards in their hand, you just get to draw 6 new cards, netting you a total of 4 cards in the process for just 3 mana. And if your opponents do play tutors and they decide to tutor a card to their hand, you can just Windfall and that card will be discarded, making their tutor useless. Danny Pink, aka the best card draw engine in this entire deck. For 4 mana, you get a 4/3 creature with the mentor mechanic, meaning whenever this creature attacks, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on another creature that's attacking with lower power than this one. All creatures you control will get a new ability. Whenever 1 or more counters would be put on this creature, you get to draw a card. And this ability triggers only once each turn. Now this card is just insane when you combine it with Sonic. Danny Pink basically reads, whenever you attack with Sonic, you get to draw 1 card for each creature with flash or haste you control. And as you've seen in this video, you will be attacking with Sonic every single turn. Danny Pink is another auto-inclusion in any sort of Sonic deck, no matter how you decide on building it. Enduring Curiosity, a 4 mana creature with flash from the Duskmourn set. And this card basically has the same passive effect as Abidant of Tassa. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to a player, you get to draw a card. And as you can imagine, in this type of aggressive deck where we will be swinging with Sonic, playing haste creatures and generating tokens, you will be connecting to opponents with a ton of creatures every single turn. And this card then just translates that into you drawing a ton of cards. And this creature having flash means it just synergizes perfectly with Sonic, and you can actually grow this and generate treasures with this. And like all the enduring cards from the Duskmourn series, whenever this creature would die, it just returns to the battlefield as an enchantment, essentially making your opponents have to deal with this card twice, making it really obnoxious to remove. And the last card in this section is Reconnaissance Mission, a 4 mana enchantment with exactly the same effect as the previous card. Whenever a creature deals damage to an opponent, you get to draw a card. The only difference being that this isn't a flash creature and it also has the cycle ability, meaning whenever this card is in your hand, you can just pay 2 generic mana to discard it and draw a new card. Obviously, Enduring Curiosity is the better card in this type of deck because it is a flash creature itself, but during testing I really felt that we needed more card draw engines in the deck, and that's why I decided to include this card in the deck as well. Next up, we have the interaction and protection section. Just because we're fast doesn't mean we're careless. In this deck, we actually do play a ton of ways to deal with any cards our opponents might be playing and a ton of ways to protect our own game plan. We do this in the form of counter magic, spot removal, board wipes, bounce spells, whatever. The benefit of being in Jeskai colors is that we have access to some of the best interaction spells in Magic. An offer you can't refuse. For 1 mana, we get to counter target non-creature spell. In return, the owner of that spell does get to create 2 treasure tokens. Now, just countering any non-creature spell that might lose you the game for 1 mana is just a really good deal. Just imagine it like this. You have a huge board of haste and flash creatures that you spend a couple of turns buffing up with Sonic. Next turn, you do have enough damage on board to take all 3 of your opponents out of the game with. But your second opponent decides to cast a board wipe. Normally, this would destroy all your creatures and just reset your tempo, and you won't be able to win the game anymore. By just leaving the 1 blue mana open, you can now counter the board wipe, give them 2 funny treasure tokens in return, and you can just still win the game on the next turn. Paw to Exile and Swords to Plowshares. 2 1 white mana instant speed spells that allow you to exile any creature on the battlefield. These are 2 of the most efficient removal spells ever printed, and you should include them in any of the decks that you play white in. Play your removal, people. Arcane Denial. This 2 mana spell allows you to counter anything on the stack, but in return the controller of the countered spell does get to draw 2 additional cards at the beginning of their next upkeep. And at the beginning of the next upkeep, we also get to draw an additional card. Now, Arcane Denial is a good card for a couple of reasons. We could run a classic counter spell over this card, but that does have 2 blue mana pips in the mana cost. And since we are a 3-color deck, Arcane Denial's mana cost is actually way easier to cast for us. Now, I do agree this card will give one of our opponents card advantage, but like I mentioned, with an offer you can't refuse, you will hold back on this counter spell just to stop any game-ending spells from disrupting your game plan. You won't be using this spell to counter a Llanowar Elves, for example. And this card also basically acts as a cantrip, because at the beginning of the next upkeep, this card will essentially replace itself by also drawing us a card. Later in the game, allowing us to dig 1 card deeper into our library and find some answers for anything we have to deal with. Boros Charm. What is, in my opinion, the strongest charm out of the entire Ravnica charm cycle. For 2 mana, you get an instant speed spell that allows you to pick 1 out of 3 fantastic options. The first option allows you to deal 4 damage to target player or planeswalker, an excellent way to deal a huge amount of damage to an opponent and take them out of the game or remove 1 of their planeswalkers. The second option allows us to give all creatures we control indestructible until the end of turn. So if an opponent is playing a board wipe or a spot removal spell, we can use the Boros Charm to protect all permanents we control. And the third option allows us to give a creature double strike until the end of turn. If you do manage to get one of your creatures to a huge amount of power by stacking counters on it with Sonic, sometimes giving a double strike on instant speed might just take an opponent out of the game. And like I mentioned earlier, we do need cards in this deck that give indestructible to actually pull off both of our combos we play in this deck. Cyclonic Rift, the last game changer card we play in this deck. For 2 mana, you get an instant speed spell that allows you to bounce any non-land permanent you don't control. That in itself is already really efficient value, just allowing you to bounce any problematic permanent on the battlefield. But the main reason why we included this card and why it is a game changer is that you can use its overload cost for 7 mana. Allowing you to bounce any non-land permanent you don't control. And what this will do is just reset the board for any player in the game but you. You bounce all their artifacts, their enchantments, their creatures, their planeswalkers, whatever. And usually the tempo swing of casting an overloaded Cyclonic Rift will just win you the game on the spot. And since we do have such an easy way in this deck generating mana by using Sonic and the treasure tokens he produces, it's really easy to cast an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. Spectacular Spider-Man, one of the strongest cards in the new Spider-Man set that's releasing later this year. For 2 mana, you get a creature with flash and 2 activated abilities. For 1 generic mana, you can give this creature flying until the end of turn, making him a little more evasive and easier to deal combat damage with. And the best part, and the thing that makes this creature just absolutely ridiculous, is its second activated ability. For 1 generic mana, you can sacrifice this creature to give all other creatures you control hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn. And this is just ridiculous for the same reasons as Boros Charm. Your opponents can't use any targeted abilities or spells on your creatures, they can't use any board wipes to reset the board, and you can use Spider-Man in both of your infinite combos. And what makes this card even better than a Boros Charm is the fact that you get it on a flash creature body, which is just fantastic with Sonic. Flawless Maneuver. This 3 mana instant speed spell will give all your creatures indestructible until the end of turn. In itself, already really solid value. But whenever we control our commander, when we would cast a spell, we can pay it without paying its mana cost. Now, as I mentioned in all my videos, all the spells that can be cast for free whenever you control your commander are absolutely broken and should be banned in the format, in my opinion. That being said, this card is just way too good not to include in the deck. Hydroelectric Specimen, a 3 mana creature with flash. And whenever this creature enters the battlefield, we are allowed to change the target of any instant or sorcery spell on the stack to this creature. If an opponent is, for example, using a Path to Exile or a Lightning Bolt or a Murder on your Sonic on the battlefield, you can just flash in this creature. This creature will be destroyed, but Sonic will be fine. Or you can also use it in the other way around. If someone is, for example, using a Giant Growth on their creature, setting up for a lethal turn, you can just flash in this creature, make the Giant Growth target this creature, and they won't get the stat boost. And baseline, whenever this creature is on the battlefield, it is a flash body you can grow with Sonic. And since this card is an MDFC card, if you don't need the creature and you actually need a land drop, you can just play the backside of this card, which is a land that taps for blue mana, and by paying 3 life, it even enters untapped. There really is no downside to including any of these MDFC land cards in your decks. Like the next card, Witch Enchanter, a 4 mana 2/2 creature that whenever it enters a battlefield will destroy an enchantment or an artifact. Just a small creature body that gives you an additional way to deal with problematic enchantments and artifacts like an Aura Shards, Phyrexian Altar, a Rhystic Study. And if you don't have any targets for this type of effect, just play the backside, which is also a land that taps for white mana and even enters untapped for the low cost of 3 life. And the last card in this section is Damning Verdict, a 5 mana board wipe that will destroy all creatures with no +1/+1 counters on them. Now, as you can imagine, in this type of Sonic deck where all our creatures will get counters whenever we just deck once with Sonic, this will just function as a one-sided board wipe unless you play against any other counter-based decks, which no one is playing in my play group. You can use this card to just reset the boards of any of your opponents, ruining their tempo or just destroying all of their blockers and connecting for lethal combat damage. And last up, we have the lands. Since this is a no budget list and we are a 3-color deck, no expenses were spared on the mana base. We also play a couple of utility lands in this deck, so I'll start by going over those. Academy Ruins, a legendary land that taps for a colorless mana, and for 2 mana, tapping it, we get to put target artifact card from our graveyard back on top of our library. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, we don't really play any recursion in this deck. So if any of your really good artifact cards like Caltrops or a Kilo do get milled, you do have a way to get them back. And if your opponents do find a way to destroy your Amulet of Vigor and actually disable the combo, Academy Ruins is another option you can use to just get it back and set up for the combo again. Minas Tirith. This land enters tapped unless you control a legendary creature. And for 2 mana and tapping this land, you get to draw a card. But you can only activate this ability if you attacked with 2 or more creatures this turn. As I mentioned before, you will want to swing with Sonic and any flash or haste creatures every single turn. And later in the game, you can then just use Minas Tirith as some sort of draw engine to just keep your hand filled and draw 1 additional card every turn. Otawara, Soaring City, the blue legendary channel land, meaning whenever this card is in your hand, you can pay the cost, discard it, and you get to activate its ability. In this case, allowing you to bounce any non-land permanent on the battlefield. And the cost of this channel ability is reduced by 1 mana for each legendary creature you control. And the channel lands don't even enter tapped, so there's no downside to including these in the deck, and later in the game they might actually provide to be really useful by using their channel abilities. Sokenzan, Crucible of Defiance, the red channel land. For 4 mana and discarding this card, we get to generate 2 1/1 spirits and give them haste until the end of turn. Once again, the cost is reduced by 1 generic mana for each legendary creature we control. And then later in the game, you can just channel this card to generate you some extra haste bodies, which you can buff up with Sonic once because they will have haste until the end of turn, and whenever these creatures take damage, you will get treasure tokens of them. And for the regular mana producing lands in this deck, we play 3 fetch lands, 3 shock lands, 3 verge lands, 3 pain lands, 3 check lands, 3 of the bond lands, 2 horizon lands, a city of brass, a command tower, an exotic orchard, a horizon of progress, a prismatic vista, a triome, and for basics we play 1 island, 2 mountains, and 3 plains. And that's it for my in-depth Sonic the Hedgehog deck. He might look like a meme commander on first sight, but whenever you see him in action, he's fast, explosive, and honestly one of the most unique decks I've brewed in a long time. If you made it all the way to the end, drop a hedgehog emoji in the comments below, so I know you watched the entire video. If you want to help me out, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon. And share this video with all your friends and your entire family. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.